The following is a hockey podcast out of Vancouver and Surrey, British Columbia. It'll only consist of a lot of puck talk and even more BS, or in actual words, banter and satire. Enjoy, and as always, go Canucks go.
A wise man once told me, you have to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And that wise man was Kyle Bowen.
You're Locked On Canucks, your daily podcast on the Vancouver Canucks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, welcome to another episode of Locked On Canucks. My name is Trevor Beggs, co-host of Locked On Canucks and also a Canucks writer currently with a Daily Hive, Vancouver. Before we dive into today's episode, we got to thank you for tuning into Locked On Canucks. You know why? Because it is your Canucks every damn day. We're part of that Locked On Podcast Network. They're doing the most for sports fans across the world. And for our show, if you haven't done so already, what are you waiting for? Make sure you go subscribe, like, follow us for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And we ain't here without the sponsors. And today's show is brought to you by Gametime. Make sure you go download that Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Gametime today. What time is it? It's game time. Man, oh man, it's starting to feel a little bit like 2023 right now because there's some pessimism in the air regarding your Vancouver Canucks. You know, the storylines we should have been talking about going to training camp are Elias Pettersson. What does he look like? Who does he play with? Quinn Hughes, Phil Pronik, are they together? Are they going to be apart? Who's going to play on the power play? But instead, the overwhelming story for your Vancouver Canucks right now is Thatcher Demko and his status heading into next season. And he's an important player for these Vancouver Canucks. I know that. You definitely know that. Because there was a case last year for a large chunk of the season that Thatcher Demko was the MVP for your Vancouver Canucks. We kind of flip-flopped Kyle and I throughout most of last season, right? Pettersson had his moments, but Miller, Hughes, and Demko were the three best players in the Canucks last season. Bar none. Obviously, I think the Norris winner probably takes home the MVP case, but Thatcher Demko was a massive reason why the Vancouver Canucks were one of the best teams in the NHL last season. Because Thatcher Demko, he's not just any ordinary goalie, okay? Again, he's one of the best goalies in the league last season. There was a point last season where the guy had 30 wins and fewer than 10 regulation losses. A .918 save percentage in an era where the average save percentage last season was about .903. Again, he's far above average right now. And your Vancouver Canucks, there should be some trepidation about what next season looks like. So what I want to do on today's episode is talk a bit about what preparing for the worst looks like for the Vancouver Canucks in the case that Demko maybe isn't healthy enough to start the regular season. Maybe is going to miss an even larger chunk of extended time. And for a guy like Demko, what is his trade value as well? We'll touch on that. And also take another look at, the most important player on the Canucks next season. And again, a bit of a closer look at one or two options out there on the free agent market. But preparing for the worst with Thatcher Demko. We kind of had a taste of what the Canucks looked like without Thatcher Demko for an extended period of time in the 2022-23 season. And I got to say, despite all the hype around Archer Shilovs, you really want two goaltenders who can play, right? And is Jiri Patera really that guy? Because right now, unless they add someone else, Jiri Patera, he's going to be the backup goalie for your Vancouver Canucks. A guy who has 6 NHL games to his name. And that is a bit of a scary proposition, right? It's a bit of a scary proposition. Right now, Archer Shilovs, again, he's going to be the guy heading into next season. And, I think there's a lot of confidence in Shilovs in this fan base. After what he did in the playoffs, obviously stepped up in the biggest moment. And right now, he's about to get underway with Olympic qualifiers as well for Team Latvia. So, I got confidence in the guy. But also, this is a guy who's played 19 games total in the NHL. And for a team like the Vancouver Canucks, with Stanley Cup aspirations, How much trust do you have in a guy who has 19 starts to his name? If you look at Thatcher Demko, for instance, I mean, he didn't really break in terms of being, a full-time NHLer and a backup at that until the 2019-20 season. At that point, this guy was 23 turning 24, right? Almost 24 years old at that point. Archer Shilov's, he's a young buck, okay? 22 years of age. That is a lot of pressure for a guy who he's barely legal drinking age down south in the States. And I do wonder, and this is the hoping for the best part of the program, if Shilovs is the guy heading into next season, right? If Demko's not ready to go, does that motivate the Canucks? Right? They should be motivated regardless, right? This is a team that had their playoff dreams, their Stanley Cup aspirations cut short by a Canadian rival. Is there some extra juice there for the Vancouver Canucks? Will they be a little bit extra motivated to play differently under Shilovs, to play for him? I also wonder, because we heard about Rick Tocchet talk about this during the offseason, right? About how last season was about getting the structure in place for this team. And they were one of the best defensive teams in the NHL. But what Rick Tocchet said he wanted to do heading into the 2024-25 campaign is kind of open things up offensively a little bit. I do wonder if he's going to be a little bit hesitant about that with Demko not in net. Because again, we can talk about Shilovs being the goalie of the future. We can talk about him being a good performer in the playoffs, but the guy is not Thatcher Demko. He's not Thatcher Demko. Shilovs, in his short time in the NHL, has shown that he can put up about average numbers, right? His career save percentage is, .908 in the NHL, .898 in the playoffs last season. Again, that's pretty much smack dab league average. So I guess that makes one of the questions. Can this Canucks team be a Stanley Cup contender? Can they be one of the best teams in the NHL with league average goaltending? I'm skeptical about that. I'm not going to lie. Again, we're prepared for the worst here. And I think preparing for the worst includes this Canucks team probably not opening things up as much offensively as they would like to with Shilovs in net instead of Demko. Now, of course, there's an argument. Should the Vancouver Canucks play any differently with Shilovs in net? And again, whether you're watching on YouTube, whether you're commenting or listening through a podcast, if you want to get in touch with us, leave me your comments. Should the Canucks play differently with Shilovs in net? Because what we saw in the latter half of last season and what we saw in the playoffs was a team, in my opinion, that played a bit too safe. They barely got the puck on net in the playoffs. They were one of the lowest shooting teams in the NHL for most of the regular season. So I think there's going to be this idea that the Canucks need to tighten things up around Shilovs. Again, we saw that in the playoffs. The proof is in last spring. But I would say that this team does need to find a way to be more lethal offensively. And they have the horses to do it, right? Yeah, they lost Lindholm up front, but the winger depth, the forward depth on this team is better. After the additions of DeBrusk, Sprong, Heinen, Sherwood. This team on paper up front should be better offensively. So I think in terms of preparing for the worst, one of my pieces of advice to the Canucks would be don't overreact to Demko being out of the lineup. A little rich from a guy who just titled this, Why the Canucks Must Prepare for the Worst with Demko. But that's just a reality, man. It's just a reality in today's NHL. But again, when you got two of the best centers in the NHL on your team, and I'm including Pettersson in that category. I talked about it during the summer. I think this guy, he could surprise everyone and have a Hart Trophy season. A lot of negativity, but this is one of the most talented players in the NHL. The Vancouver Canucks need to make sure that they are still prioritizing offensive creativity, despite the fact that they don't have their main horse in net. Because last season, we saw early on, they were the highest scoring team in the NHL in the first half of the season, despite not shooting much. The Canucks, they need to create more of their own luck. And maybe some luck will come their way because This Demko news is very unlucky right now. On the other side, let's talk a bit about Demko's trade value, okay? In this worst case scenario, in this preparing for the worst scenario, does it make any sense to see what other teams would give up for Thatcher Demko? A very hypothetical conversation, man, but this is a hypothetical podcast, Locked On Canucks, your Canucks every day. Let's touch on that on the other side. Before we do that, we got to shout out our friends over at Gametime. You know the deal, baby. Whether you're an everydayer or an occasional listener, that Gametime, they are the only place you should be going to if you're trying to buy tickets, okay? And you want to know why? Mainly, first and foremost, because they got that lowest price guarantee. So you know that if you find tickets cheaper on another app, Gametime, they got your back and they will credit you with 110% of the difference. And Gametime, they're stepping up their game, man. No pun intended, because they got a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks, they filter out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. So go use that Gametime app, okay? Because not only they got the lowest price guarantee, they got views from their seat on the app. They got all-in pricing, so you're not surprised by all those fees. And that Gametime ticket coverage, okay? Your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take that guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Go download that Gametime app, tap, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? It's game time. Let's go. All right. We're back here on Locked On Canucks. Your Canucks every damn day. And I guess that's partly a lie because, hey, we take the weekends off. And in the summer, we're 3 days a week. But I'm likely recording 4 this week for you. Even in the dead of August when the only news is the Demko disaster. And that's what Brandon's saying in the comments. Not another Demko disaster, please. There's been a few of them, right? There's been a few Demko disasters here. And the injury history for this guy is piling up. Right? The glass half full is when he is on the ice, he has shown that he's one of the best damn goaltenders in the entire NHL. You know, over the last 3 years, one of the best even strength save percentages in the NHL. He was way better on the PK last season. That boosted his numbers because even back in 2022-23, you know, his numbers were around average, but that's because he was, you know, his save percentage in the PK was horrid. But again, this is one of the best goalies in the NHL. Unfortunately, like Brandon alluded to with this comment, the Demko disaster has been the health, right? We talked about it before. He had hip surgery in college. He had a concussion in Utica. He's had multiple knee problems. He had a big groin problem in 2022-23. The injury history is piling up for this guy. And we've heard it before. Like, Demko is a very motivated individual in terms of his body. I think Jim Rutherford used this term in an interview this summer where he said he's a bit of a freak in terms of his body and his fitness. I wonder partly if that could be a detriment to him. Because maybe he's pushing too hard to get back in the lineup. Again, you got a team of medical professionals around you, so you know they can call the shots one way or the other. But I think you might have a guy in Demko who maybe has pushed too hard to get back. Because you know, you get to this level and you're a competitor. You're a dog. Demko is a dog. And again, in 2022-23, the season was lost. There's no need to, you know, rush back, right? You're supposed to be out 6 weeks. He was out 3 months. But last season, they get him in for the final 2 games. He plays 1 playoff game and he's done. Was that the smartest decision? In hindsight, probably not. And then he pushes to come back in the playoffs. And now we've learned that he has not skated since prior to Game 7 against the Edmonton Oilers. So in this preparing for the worst situation with Demko, you got to ask yourself, does it make any sense to trade Thatcher Demko? And my mentality has been, even with the injury history, that you have a guy right now on an absolute bargain of a contract, $5 million per season for the next 2 seasons. A reminder that Elvis Merzlikins in Columbus, one of the worst goalies in the NHL last season, is making over $5 million. Demko is about, again, we've talked about, he's way above league average, but he's paid like a league average starter. That's a big win for the Vancouver Canucks. And if you trade him, it's going to hurt the depth, right? Like, theoretically, if you're trading Demko, you got to get another body in the door. Like, this team just can't roll with Shilovs and Patera and hope that they can win the Stanley Cup. And we'll talk a bit about one of the other goalies as well. Or maybe a couple of the free agent goalies. But obviously, there's one in particular in Kevin Lankinen who's still floating out there last I checked. And the Canucks, according to reports, have shown interest in bringing him in. But we'll touch on that in a bit. But before we do that, let's talk about Demko's trade value. Unfortunately, why it probably doesn't make sense to trade Demko right now is his value's depressed. How many teams are desperate enough to trade for a goalie with an injury history like Demko? I will say there's probably a few because of how damn good Thatcher Demko is. Like, it's not a direct comparable, but I kind of look at this similar to the Jack Eichel situation, right? Obviously, there's some different dynamics with Eichel. Buffalo didn't want him to get the surgery he wanted. Vegas was willing to do it. But there was this idea that maybe Eichel was damaged goods. He had toiled away on a sad sack team for 7 years prior to getting traded. But when he did get traded, what did he do? He helped the Vegas Golden Knights win the damn Stanley Cup. So this idea that maybe you're not going to get as much for Demko, I think it has some merit, obviously. But I do think there's teams around the NHL that look at a guy like Demko and go, this guy can help us. I mean, unfortunately, I think some of the teams that need goaltending the most are probably in the Canucks division. And that's a bit of a problem, right? I think of the Edmonton Oilers. He ain't going there. The LA Kings, they could use a goalie. I know they just got Kemper, but Demko is on another level. But when we're talking about trade value, you got to look at some recent trades, and I think the one that stands out to me is the Jacob Markstrom deal. The Linus Ullmark one is a comparable as well, but with both those deals, I think with the Markstrom deal, we'll touch on that one first. So Markstrom this offseason, when he was traded from the Calgary Flames and the New Jersey Devils, he netted the Flames just a first-round pick and Kevin Ball. So a young player, but basically a third-pairing defenseman, right? Now, I think with Demko, he's got to get a bit more than that because he's younger, because he's on an amazing contract. But they're comparable because Markstrom was also one of the best goalies in the NHL last season. But for Demko, what does that deal look like? I think it's a first-round pick for sure. It might even be another young goaltender who can come into the system, and it's a roster player. So I think it's the typical first-round pick, prospect, and roster player, and it's got to be probably someone a bit more than Kevin Ball. Now, where a Demko trade could get interesting is, could Demko net the Canucks that second pairing right shot defenseman they're looking for, or even just another top 4 defenseman in general? If you can get a first-round pick and a top 4 defenseman for Demko, it would open things up for you. Now, obviously, the cap is a consideration here as well. Because you usually top 4 defensemen, unless it's a young guy on an entry-level deal, those guys, they get paid a few bucks, right? Likely over $5 million. And if the Canucks were to trade Demko, theoretically, they'd have to add another goaltender to this team. Because there's no way that Patrick Allvin, one of the busiest GMs in the NHL, one of the biggest dogs out there. We're talking about dogs in this episode. Patrick Allvin, he's a damn dog, okay? Patrick Allvin is not going into the season with Artur Shilovs and Leo Patera long term in this hypothetical situation where the Canucks potentially trade Thatcher Demko. Now, if you want to look at the Ullmark deal, we'll touch on that one quickly as well. When he was traded from the Bruins to the Senators, he was traded in exchange for Marcus Stellick, so a bottom 6 roster player, Jonas Korpisalo, and a round 1 pick in the 2024 draft. So, yeah, not a great haul either, to be honest, right? It's hard to trade goalies in the NHL. And Ullmark was a guy who won the Vezina not that long ago. But part of the reason the deal was made is because I think teams knew that Boston was in a bit of a bind, that they more or less had to trade one of those two goaltenders. So maybe I'll touch on later this week, potential teams and more concrete deals for Demko in this hypothetical situation. But I will say, unless the deal absolutely blows your socks off, I'm not a fan of trading Thatcher Demko. Call me crazy, call me stupid. I still trust the guy to get his health back and help this team win the Stanley Cup. But I'm just a dreamer, baby. Locked On Canucks, your Canucks every damn day. We're preparing for the worst, but we're also full of positivity here, okay? Let's wrap up the show on the other side. Talk about some doom and gloom in the comments, but also touch on a goalie who's still floating out there in Kevin Lankinen. That's coming up on the other side here on Locked On Canucks. All right, you're back here on Locked On Canucks. Your Canucks almost every damn day. I'm Trevor Beggs, co-host of the show. My co-host Kyle Bowen still in Mexico. I haven't heard from him, man. I'm a little bit worried about him and his little chocolate Bacardi problem, but I know the guy switched to margaritas down there. He did try to have one margarita before he left, and I think he only finished half of it. So, everyone pray for Kyle Bowen. He's a wise man, and I'm sure he'll get home in one piece with not too bad of a hangover. Now, honestly, it's fascinating to me and a bit mind-boggling that Kevin Lankinen is still available on the free agent market. Why has no one signed this guy? It's hard to believe. So, let's look at some of the numbers on Kevin Lankinen. And here's something I want to bring up. In terms of save percentage at even strength last season, here's your top 5 goaltenders. First off, it was Anthony Stolarz in Florida, Laurent Brossoit with the Winnipeg Jets, Connor Hellebuck with the Winnipeg Jets, and Kevin Lankinen with a .934 save percentage at even strength. The dude was lights out last season. And, it's interesting because Kevin Lankinen didn't really... most backups play a bit more than Kevin Lankinen did last season, right? He played 24 games. Your UC Saros in Nashville. He has been the busiest starter in the NHL over the past couple of seasons. And even last season, UC Saros, the most games played in the NHL with 64. But Kevin Lankinen made the most of his minutes with the Nashville Predators. And again, kind of surprising that he hasn't been signed by a team yet. And I completely get why the Canucks would have interest in him. Because, even if he comes in, if the Canucks sign him and Demko's healthy, we got all this love for Shelovs right now, but the guy isn't waiver eligible. You could theoretically, and I know people aren't really a fan of this, you could theoretically put Shelovs in the minors for another season, let him cook, let him marinate, if Demko's healthy, and you got Kevin Lankinen in the fold. I think something like that does make a lot of sense, right? Again, the guy was pretty damn good last season. 24 games played, an 11-6 record overall. A .908 save percentage, so above the average, but it was at even strength where he really shone. Now, I think one thing that has to be considered is the cap for your Vancouver Canucks as well, right? Lankinen could probably command a deal at $2 million plus. The Canucks could theoretically fit that under the cap. I know they don't want to, but they could theoretically fit it under the cap right now because they got about $200,000 in cap space, not including Tucker Poolman's 2.5 cap hit. That could go on LTIR and will go on LTIR. So the Canucks are playing with about $2.7 million of wiggle room right now. I know from the reports out there and comments from Alvin in the past that the team would prefer to go into the season with the roster as is. There's more benefit for a team to be under the cap and then put a player on LTIR as opposed to what teams have done in the past, where you have to LTIR a player to be cap compliant. But this is a different situation because, saving a few bucks here and there is nice. But what matters more is winning the Stanley Cup. And again, you're really going on a hope and a prayer thinking the Canucks can win the Stanley Cup with Shelovs and Patera. Although Kevin Lankinen, And we're talking about our Stanley Cup odds increasing with Lankinen, and I think that's fair, but let's temper expectations. Neither of these guys is Thatcher Demko. And that's why, well, I think that conversation about trading him is an interesting one. I'm on the fence, or I'm on the side of keeping Demko in Vancouver, letting him get healthy. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention, looking at these goalies here in terms of even strength save percentage, a guy who just barely kind of cracks, or just outside the top 10, I should say, was Jiri Patera. Jiri Patera last season, a .926 save percentage in his 6 games with the Vegas Golden Knights. So he showed some promise last season. He showed some promise in the AHL. I think we all like the signing. But again, are you comfortable as a Canuck fan going into the season with goalie and Patera, who's played 8 NHL games, and then a goalie in Chelsea who played 19 NHL games total? That's 27 career games of NHL experience between Patera and Shilovs. Most backups play more than that in one season. So I do think, obviously, some trepidation with the Canucks cap, but Kevin Lankinen should absolutely be a target if this team has good intel that Demko won't be ready to start the regular season. Let's get to a couple comments before I get out of here. Again, you're listening to Locked On Canucks. A Nuck fans got the right idea, okay? Demko for McDavid 1-for-1 seems pretty fair. No, Evans has got to be cap compliant, right? They got to sign that Draisaitl guy. They need a goaltender. It just makes too much sense, right? And Nuck fan saying maybe even throw in Draisaitl as a little sweetener. No, I don't want Draisaitl, man. F that guy. You know, there's something floating around online about him talking trash about Quinn Hughes at a restaurant when he's meeting some Oilers fan. Nah. But McDavid, I'm down for that. Let's get him in here. Nuck fan, one more comment from him. He's bringing the optimism, okay? You know what? Actually, I'm going to go pessimism first, and let's end on an optimistic note. Chad Richards saying the Canucks are cooked. Best case scenario, they finish as 26th. Man, optimism not in the air with Chad. Now, 26 is a little bullish, man. Chad, you gotta have some orange juice, man. Get out in the sunshine. Unbelievable, the pessimism. My God. But I think, you know, even with Demko healthy, it's fair to maybe expect a bit of regression with the Canucks, right? They did regress in the final 2 months of the season. But again, this is one of the most efficient teams in terms of shooting percentage last season, right? And in net, they were one of the best teams in terms of save percentage, largely because of Thatcher Demko, although Casey DeSmith had some good moments, especially earlier on in the season as well. But again, it's fair to expect some regression, right? That being said, I still think this team is absolutely a playoff team, with or without Demko. Again, putting my faith in Shilovs and Patera and maybe Kevin Lankinen. But I think there's enough there up front. I think there's enough there with his coaching staff on defense. This Canucks team is a playoff team. But at this point, regression almost seems like a foregone conclusion based on the Demko news, based on the defense being weaker than last season. Primarily those two things. But again, let's end on an optimistic note. Where was it? Nuck fan. He was saying, if Vegas can win a cup with their third string goalie, Aiden Hill at the time, then the Canucks can do it with Shilovs and Patera in net. Man, oh man, I'm giving the round of applause here, okay? Nuck fan 77 has been drinking his orange juice, man. This guy's been getting in the sunshine. He's been going for walks. He's been exercising. He's been doing it, okay? And you need to make sure that you do it too. Dan Jardine saying trading Demko at this moment would be a big mistake. Trade him when he's healthy and only if Shilov shows real growth in net. Now, for the most part, I do agree with Dan there, and I've said it. I think trading Demko is likely a mistake unless you can net like an absolute haul for him. But we just haven't seen that with goalie trades in the past. So I think that's a bit of a pipe dream. The catch-22 to trading Demko, if Shilov shows real growth in net, is I think you end up in a bit of a situation like the Boston Bruins where teams around the NHL, and it was similar to Markstrom in a way, people knew that he wanted out of Calgary. When your hands are tied, when your cards are on the table, you're not going to get as big of a return. And trading Demko would be a massive, massive deal for this team. But you also got to hedge your bets a bit too, right? It is extremely risky to trade Demko right now. With, again, 2 goalies on your roster. The next 2 goalies in the depth chart have a combined 27 games of NHL experience. So the Canucks got to prepare for the worst with Demko, but you got to hope for the best, baby, just like NuckFan77 is doing, all right? Let's go. And I got to get out of here, okay? So shout out to you and you and you, whether you're an everyday or an occasional listener, first-time listener, a new subscriber, or you join us on the live show on YouTube. Don't matter to me when you're listening, where you're listening. I just appreciate the hell out of you for tuning in to Locked On Canucks, your Canucks every day. Got a couple more episodes lined up for you this week. I got some trash for a trash comment for one of these, but I want to touch on draft picks that will haunt the Canucks forever. And the premise really is what guys were drafted shortly after the Canucks picked in round 1. And maybe we'll make a team of Canuck players who could have been Canuck players. It's a little fascinating list I got together. I know people are saying I'm negative. I don't care, man. I have fun doing these lists. We'll also touch on the Canucks prospect pool as well. And we'll get you covered on any news that breaks here in terms of Demko or your Vancouver Canucks in the coming days. But again, I do got to get out of here. Thanks again for listening to Locked On Canucks, your Canucks every damn day.
Your Locked On Canucks, your daily podcast on the Vancouver Canucks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.